Yes, thank you very much for being here. I've already introduced myself. My name is Björn. I'm a lecturer at SOAS, and today I want to talk about what I like to call the cycle of superiorism. And I would like to start with a definition. And that definition is what I try to what I think the word superiorism shall mean within the following presentation. It shall be defined as the conviction of one's own superiority towards a perceived inferior other as an observable factual reality, entitling or even necessitating the allegedly superior one to dominate the allegedly inferior other. And this superiorism lies, I would argue, at the heart of Western thought. There's a certain pattern that superiorism becomes a reality and reinforces itself. And this pattern shall be addressed as the cycle of superiorism. And that cycle of superiorism begins with the observation of a difference. Listen, for instance, to the American physician Samuel Adolphus Cartwright, who lived from 1793 to 1863. He writes in his 1851 report on the diseases and physical peculiarities of the Negro race about a difference between white human beings and peoples of Africa. And the people of Africa, he observes, a defective hematosis or atmospherization of the blood conjoined with the deficiency of the cerebral matter in the cranium and an excess of nervous matter distributed to the organs of sensation and assimilation. And he goes on, this difference is the true cause of the debasement of the mind, which has rendered the people of Africa unable to take care of themselves. It is the true cause of their indolence, apathy, and where they have chosen through countless ages, idleness, misery, and barbarism to industry and frugality. Why social industry or associated labor, so essential to all progress in civilization and improvement, has never made any progress amongst them. No buildings, roads, or improvements, or monuments of any kind are anywhere found to indicate that they have ever been awakened from their apathy and sleepy indolence to physical or mental exertion. This pronounced microcosmic cellular difference between blood and the cerebral matter is mirrored in the perceived macrocosmic differences in cultural achievements. And I, of course, say intentionally perceived because fairly obvious, I do not agree with his assessment. Immanuel Kant, following an observation of David Hume, also noted a similar difference in the cultural achievements of different human beings. No one, he writes in his observations on the feelings of the beautiful and the sublime, could find an example where a Negro has demonstrated any talents, and asserts that amongst the hundreds or of thousands of blacks who have been transported elsewhere from their countries, although very many of them have been set free, nevertheless, not a single of them has ever been found who has accomplished something great in art or science or has shown any other praiseworthy quality. While amongst the whites, there are always those who rise up from the lowest rubble through extraordinary gifts and earn respect in the world. So essential is the difference between these human kinds, and it seems to be just as great with regard to the capacities of mind as it is with respect to color. So Kant and Cartwright seem to perceive the very same phenomenon. Certain human beings seem to be able to achieve something that is assessed as praiseworthy or great, while others are apparently unable to do so. The language that Kant and Cartwright use, including terms like defective, great, indolence, defective, great, and indolence, indicate that they have not only observed a merely empirical difference. Kant and Cartwright do not observe that one is simply not like the other and that the other is simply not like the one. They do indeed observe more than that. They have found a normative difference. The allegedly empirical phenomenon to Kant and Cartwright is a normative phenomenon at the same time. In fact, we can only artificially separate the observation of the phenomenon and its normative interpretation. So in the cycle of superiorism, after the observation of the difference, the next step is the normative interpretation of the difference. The difference observed by Kant and Cartwright are observations of some human beings like this and some human beings like that. And at the same time, these observations are about a human being like this and thus being superior, and about some other human being being like that, and thus being inferior. And this is the difference between the one, and this difference between the one and the other human being is presented to the reader as a fact, as a self-evident reality that needs no further explanation. So Kant and Cartwright do not claim that those who are identified as inferior do not produce anything that could be considered. They do not claim that they do not produce, that they do not add anything to humanity at all. What they seem to assume is that they do not produce anything that could be regarded as praiseworthy. The other human being only reproduces otherness. And otherness, presumably since it lacks oneness, and that is superiority, can and will be nothing but otherness, and that is inferiority. There seems to be an insurmountable chasm between the one and the other human, as Kant said, an essential difference. The one and the other human being are as far away from each other as possible in order to still belong to the same class of living beings. Kant and Cartwright do not claim to have arbitrarily posited that one human being is superior. Rather, they do endeavor to present this as a self-evident fact. They are observing a normative ontological division of humanity, and they assume we, the audience, they assume that we, their audience, will see this difference too. We all are, given the ineluctable evidence of the matter, necessitated into accepting the factual reality of superior and inferior human beings, or in other words, of superhumans and subhumans. The superiority they reclaim for themselves and those who are like them is presented as the unavoidable result of a level-headed observation of reality. And it is important to note that we're never provided with any philosophical explanation for that normative interpretation. It is important to understand that we do not find a single actual philosophical argument for this. This might be due to the fact that Kant and Cartwright seem to think, or they seem to pretend to do so, that the normative interpretation is simply not an interpretation, but a positing. That it is not a positing of a superiorist idea. It is to them, apparently, nothing else but an incontestable observation of an empirical and self-evident fact. It is not a lot that we learn from what Kant and Cartwright say about the allegedly inferior people. However, we do learn a lot about those who seem to consider themselves to be superior. We learn, for example, that Cartwright prefers buildings. We learn that Kant prefers greatness in art and science. But we do not learn why that is to be preferred by anyone else, or why that would be preferable in itself. We do not learn why everything that is of value has to be plotted on the matrix of Kant's and Cartwright's understanding of value. Kant and Cartwright seem appalled by others for being different and thus inferior, while ignoring that they have arbitrarily posited the other as the inferior out of the strangest narcissistic revulsion to those who are not like them. But again, this legitimization for the normativity rests purely on the alleged observability and the creatio ex nihilo of normativity. It is as if our observers, Kant and Cartwright, seem to say to us, to their audience, who's willing and who's able to see will see. He who has ears, let him hear. And not only the factum brutum can be seen and heard, but its inherent natural normativity. And that is something, that something is better than something else cannot be held against us. So it seems that our authors are certain they have not introduced the normative chasm between inferior and superior entities. They have simply discovered this chasm. They have just unveiled the brute fact of their own superiority, a fact which can be observed and which is, because of its observability and its alleged empirical foundation, in no further need of additional evidence for its truth. So it is like as if they would continue to instruct us. Furthermore, it cannot be held against us, we can imagine them saying. that we're part of that which is superior, and that we have to do what has to be done because we are part of that which is superior. And neither can it be held against us that the other part of that which is inferior and that we have to do what is to be done because the other is part of what is superior. So superiority morphed from something observable into something that is evident, and the same is true for inferiority. Cartwright writes, in the anatomical conformation of his, and he means the black person's, knees, we see the genuflexed written in its physical structure, being more flexed and bent than any other kind of man. Cartwright seems to think he is, and hence, after being taught by him, we all are able to see inferiority. Kant seemingly thought so too, at least in some point in his philosophical career. Just remember the argument Kant presents to dismiss an in itself problematic remark made by a black carpenter. And Kant comments here, there might be something worth considering in that person's remark, except for the fact that the scoundrel was completely black from head to foot, a distinct proof that what he said was stupid. Cartwright, other than Kant, gives his inferiorism a theological grounding. Inferiority is not just the way it is. Inferiority and its practical consequences are, in fact, the deity's will, as he says. Inferiority and superiority thus become inherent traits of the divine creation. Cartwright cannot protest the will of God. That's sort of the position he hides behind. The knees of the black people need to be kept bent. And that is not his fault. That is something he finds in creation and something that he now has to simply take into account while organizing his own life. Kant would certainly not have agreed with this theological framework, but Kant, too, as we've already learned, finds incontestable evidence for inferiority. For example, he says, the religion of fetishes, which is widespread amongst them, so the black people, is perhaps a sort of idolatry which sinks so deeply into the ridiculous as ever seems to be possible for human nature. A bird's feather, a cow's horn, a shell, or any other common thing, as soon as it is consecrated with some words, is an objection of veneration and of the invocation in swearing oath. And he goes on in the Kollegentwürfe on his anthropology written in the 1780s to say, black people are lively, full of affect and passion, talkative, vain, devoted to pleasures, accept the culture of the servants, but not the free ones, and are incapable of governing themselves, children. So this is in Kant's understanding something that cannot be debated. Kant does not present this as the result of an assessment of black people, but it's the self-evident material any assessment has to begin with. And how different are white people presented? Let us remember when he said, coming from the lowest rabble, which is apparently of equal horror than enslavement, they can earn respect in the world. The world, however, does not refer to the world in totality. It refers only to the relevant, to the praiseworthy part of the world. That is the world of the white human beings. Or more polemically, the world of human beings like Kant. The world of the human being, that world in which human beings like Kant live in, the world wherein the alleged superior human beings can find a narcissistic echo of themselves. In the world of the other human beings, the rather worthless other, the non-white world, there is, because the superior human being cannot find itself in there, nothing to be found. The black world is, due to its non-whiteness, a worthless world. And there is, in other words, the white world in the insignificant rest. We always have to be aware that Kant makes a fairly strong distinction between the empirical human being and the human being he addresses in his critical philosophy, between the species of the human beings and the human beings who continue to develop humanity. The superior human beings, so to speak, are human beings where we always have to think of a little asterisk next to the word human. In Kant's understanding, it is not slavery that prevents black people's creativity. This does not explain the perceived deficiency of black people. It is the other way around in Kant's understanding. The black people became deficient before they were enslaved. They are enslaved because of an antecedent degeneration. And he says, I made a little mistake here. Kant writes, Americans, and by Americans he always refers to the indigenous peoples of America, and Negroes cannot govern themselves. They only serve as slaves. This deficiency, this inability to govern oneself is not because of this or that accident. The deficiency became a quasi-substantial problem. Blackness, or more precisely, the problem of non-whiteness. Non-white human beings are no longer a human being with a different deficiency. Their very humanity seems deficient. From a multiplicity of descriptions of countries, Kant says in his review of Herder's ideas, one can prove, if one wants to, that Americans and Negroes are each a race sunk beneath the remaining members of the human species in their mental predispositions. And in the physical geography, it says humanity has its highest degree of perfection in the white race. Yellow Indians have a somewhat lesser talent. The Negroes are much lower, and the lowest of it all is part of the American races. These human beings who sunk beneath the remaining members of the human beings, who much not lower, if not the lowest, are not the concern of the Kantian transcendental philosophy. They are not invited to the project of enlightenment, since they are unable to participate, since they simply cannot follow the imperative of the sapere aude. But this is not a problem, but this is not the problem. These human beings are no longer needed for humanity's progress anyway. There's nothing to expect from these humans. They have lost their purpose, and that means they have lost their ability to contribute to humanity's overall progress as humans. And this is why Kant noted, man is an animal that perfects itself, and not just the individual, but also and especially the species. He cannot maintain himself in the state of nature. And secondly, nature intends to cultivate him and develop all talents, and is not concerned with evils. And thirdly, by civilizing and moralizing emerges in the end the unity of happiness and morality. The other human being, the non-white human being, has nothing to contribute to the further perfection of the species animal. And Kant explains to us remarkably prosaically, humans have such a drive to perfect themselves that they even consider a people which has finished its development and merely enjoys itself to be superfluous, and think that the world would lose nothing if Otaheite went down. So explicitly he says humanity would lose nothing if the island of Otaheite would go down. So the drive to perfect themselves is deeply entrenched in the Enlightenment thought. We can find it prominently, especially in the German traditions, and very prominently in Kant. The Critique of Pure Reason, Kant famously declares that our human reason, and we have to remember that's the human reason where the human carries its asters with this, is driven by a propensity of its nature to go beyond its use and experience, to venture to the outermost bounds of all cognition by mere ideas in a pure sense, and to find peace only in the completion of its circle in a self-subsisting systematic whole. So Kant's philosophy is above all else a philosophy of the human being. However, he is concerned with the question of the final determination of the human being. The human being's original vocation, as Kant determines it in his essay, What is Enlightenment, lies precisely in progress. Whoever cannot contribute to this progress cannot and ought not participate in the project of enlightenment. This is not, and this is not an undertaking of a single superior human being, but of all superior humankind. It is incomprehensible, or more precisable, it is unacceptable or even offensive for Kant that there, and let us for the sake of the argument imagine with Kant that this is the case, might be a people which has finished its development and merely enjoys itself, or who do not agree that they have to make themselves, in a Kantian sense, worthy of humanity by actively struggling with the obstacles that cling to them because of the crudity of their nature. In the writings of the great Enlightenment thinker Kant, we cannot find any attempt to comprehend the other as the other. The other is always the despicable non-one. This is This is the definitions par excellence of the other, non-oneness. Every other characteristic is secondary. The other human being is not needed, and the further development of humanity will show that. Kant noted this about white people. The white people contain all the incentives of nature in facts and passions, all talents, all predispositions for culture and civilization, and can both obey and rule. They're the only ones who always progress towards perfection. And this will determine inevitably the future development of human beings in their totality. All inferior people will one day no longer exist because they're no longer needed. This future will be lacking nothing. Everything not white is superfluous in such a deep sense that in the moment when there's nothing else but whiteness, nothing is missing. Remember, the world would lose nothing if Otaheite went down. The superior human race and the human race will become synonymous in this obscene white supremacist fantasy. This is the future as envisioned by the brightest shining light of the European Enlightenment, a radically de-othered, de-subhumanized, de-non-whitened humanity led by nature to eventually arrive at, as Kant says, the unity of happiness and morality. Kant cannot and Kant will not comprehend the other human being as human beings of value sui generis, as valuable in and of themselves, but only as inferior compared to those like himself. And these thoughts about the human being and humanity tell us nothing about the other, but it speaks volumes about Kant and the self-understanding of the inventor of modern critical philosophy. And from that, I'm going to move on to the next phase within the cycle of superiorism, the entitlement of domination. Finding oneself superior means in practical terms to find oneself entitled or even necessitated to dominate the inferior other. Often enough, the superior one seems to be unable to leave the inferior alone. There's a quite obsessive way in which Kant so often returns to discuss those whom he deems inferior. The inferior other seems to urge the superior one to react to the outrageous fact of inferiority. Kant, for example, says in his observations, the blacks are vain, but in the Negro's way, and so talkative that they must be driven apart from each other by blows. Americans and Negroes, he says, as we've already heard, cannot govern themselves, thus only serve as slaves. But what a strange conclusion this is, what strange conclusions these are. Could the indigenous peoples of America and black peoples could they not simply be left alone? Why do they have to serve as slave? And where does the thus, in German, the also, in the second sentence here on the slide, where does that come from? Kant uses it in the second sentence, but I cannot identify any motivation for that thus or also in the first sentence. So how is this motivated? How can these two sentences be connected like this? It seems impossible for Kant to think of these peoples as perhaps strange, perhaps incomprehensible occurrences of inferior otherness. This is not an oddity the superior one looks at and then finds them to be worthless and just leaves them alone to live their inferior life. Apparently, this is not at all something that the self-aggrandized superhuman can do. It seems that we have to understand that the line of thought has shifted. Something has happened that even goes beyond the coincidence of observation and normative interpretation. There's an immediate practical consequence of the normative difference. Again, we can only artificially separate this consequence from its antecedents. We have thus seen that observation, normative interpretation, and practical consequences are forced to coincide in the strangest unit. And this unit continues to receive its validity from its pseudo-empirical, pseudo-self-evidence. Apparently, the superiority of the one cannot rest in the glory of its own superiority. It has to become practical, and it seems it has to become applied. We learn that the normative difference is perceived as an entitlement, if not as an imperative to engage in a certain derisive practice. And this, in the cases we've discussed, this is a practice of submission or of slavery. If someone is not how someone should be to be of value, and that is not being the inferior other, but being the superior one, then the self-declared superior human beings find themselves to be entitled to force the other human beings to reduce their otherness, to reduce them to their otherness as much as possible, to not disturb the superior human beings being superior, to be at least somewhat useful for the superior human being, for instance, by becoming their slaves. The Black human being needs the education by the white human being. The white human being has to teach the Black human being, which is a very commonplace in the colonial literature, to be as little Black as possible. Of course, never to the point of whiteness. Racist superiorism is often to be found, as Robert Bernasconi remarked, in the gesture which demands become like us, and which adds sotto voce, you can never become like us because you're not one of us. The normative difference has created a world of those inferior and those superior, and the superior ones are entitled to force the inferior ones to do what the superhumans decide. We have claimed that the allegedly inferior other is the creation, that it is a phantasma of the allegedly superior one. However, as soon as the superiorist transforms the alleged superiority into a practical political reality, a factually dominating force becomes reality, and the inferior becomes something that is factually dominated. And again, we can imagine how Kant and Cartwright would defend themselves. They might have said to us, we're not forcing the subhumans to be subhumans. This is just what they are. And this has practical consequences for us. On the one hand, they do disturb the further development of the superhumanity. And on the other hand, an unguided subhuman will be the most unhappy creature. For the greater good of our development and their modest happiness, we're obliged to guide, even using force, these unhappy, helpless creatures to become at least somewhat useful. Yes, this will be to our benefit and hence somewhat happy. This, however, will be to their benefit. And yes, we're benefiting from that, but we're not motivated by this benefit. Certainly not. This benefit is nothing but the consequence of our honest engagement in that which has to be done for the sake of humanity. And who would hold that against that? There's even more to praise. Cartwright, for example, insists that not only do the enslaved human being and the enslaver benefit, in fact, and this is quite similar to Kant's thought, all of humanity benefits. There's a third party which benefits. It's the world at large. The 3 million of bales of cotton made by Negro labor afforded cheap clothing for the civilized world. This is the time-honored Aristotelian excuse for the consumptions of the lives of others. Similar to Kant, Cartwright claims that all of humanity, meaning, of course, the asterisk humanity, benefits by letting Black human beings enjoy their beneficial enslavement. And to achieve this threefold good, as Cartwright further explains, there are certain things that ought to be done. Like children, they, that is the Black human beings, require government in everything. Food, clothing, exercise, sleep, all require to be prescribed by rule, or they will run into excess. Like children, they're apt to overeat themselves or to confine their diet too much to one favorite article, unless restrained from doing so. They often gorge themselves with fat meat, as children do with sugar. We have, as Cartwright continues, to know the great primary truth, that the Negro is a slave by nature and never can be happy, industrious, moral, or religious in any other condition than the one he was intended to fill. It is of great importance to the theologian, the statesman, and to all those who are at heart seeking to promote his temporal and future welfare. And this is truly disturbing. Slavery all of a sudden becomes the testimony of the deeply felt humanism practiced by those, as Cartwright says, who are at heart seeking to promote future welfare of Black human beings. And again, this is based on the pseudo self-evident fact that here is given the theatrical name of the great primary truth, that there's a truth before all other truth, incontestable, true by virtue of itself. Cartwright dehumanizes the Black human beings with unrelenting epistemological brutality. The most disturbing climax of his anti-human thought can be found in his ridiculous invention of the pathology he called drapetomania. He departed from the norms of medical profession most dramatically when he attempted to naturalize the slave system through describing this psychological disease of enslavement. Drapetomania, Cartwright explains, is a disease of the mind of the Black human being, causing him to abscond. And he knows that with the advantages of proper medical care strictly followed, this troublesome practice that many Negroes have of running away can be almost entirely prevented. They have only to be treated like children with care, kindness, attention, and humanity to prevent and cure them from running away. So the desire of Black human beings to flee from their enslavement is suddenly no longer an existential urge of these dehumanized human beings to abscond their agony. No, it is suddenly an unfortunate pathology to be cured with care and kindness by the white superhumans and their whips. And with that, I'm going to move on to the last part of the cycle of superiority, which is practice and reinforcement. Every practice of domination, be it one of brutal violence or one of, for example, tacit microaggression, such as a domination through enforced ignorance or gaslighting, will reinforce the understanding of the superior as the superior and of the inferior as the inferior. From the observation of inferiority, which is, as we have established, actually a posited arbitrary inferiority, it was inferred to be righteously entitled to not only continue to remain in the pseudo-natural state of superiority, but to actively dominate those who and that which is inferior, and thus practically create and reinforce superiority of the one and mutatis mutandis, the inferiority of the other. The reinforcing practices of domination will lead again to an observation of difference. The other is, even though the other was arbitrarily via a creatio ex nihilo in the beginning posited as an inferior human being, is now an established entity in the ontology of the allegedly superior. The cycle of superiorism can and will begin anew, although now, as we have to add, the cycle is more predetermined to reproduce its initial assumption. With that, I want to give some concluding remarks. The created others are not encompassed by the moral standards of the ones. The others can be treated without producing a contradiction in the moral self-understanding of the ones by divergent moral rules. Superiorism is perhaps pathological incapability and or unwillingness to accept otherness sui generis, to incorporate the reality of the other into one's own reality. It is an incapability, an inability, and or an unwillingness to take the other as the other seriously. One could be tempted to think the superiorist might seem to be unconcerned by the problem of a double standard. However, we would argue that all these intellectual contortions clearly show that the superiorists knew fairly well that they are undermining their own moral ideals. The superiorists rewrite their stories and transubstantiate themselves from being abhorrent violators into those who suffer from the pseudo-tragic destiny of the superiorist human being, the superiorist being forced to develop an ethics of the one and an ethics of the other for the greater good of humanity. We have to come back to the difference again. There's something that all the observed differences share. The actually relevant difference is not the one between the one and the other culture, not between the one and the other skin color. It seems that the actually relevant difference is this one. It's the one between the dominatable by the one. The difference is who is dominatable and who is not dominatable. And that is where superiority becomes substantiated. The moment in which one can identify the opportunity to exert violence over the other, being able to violently rule, to own the other, to enforce one's power over the other, to tell the other where to go, to determine what development means. all this violence is at the heart of superiorism. And that means that superiorism means nothing but domination, and the superiorists' invention of inferiority means nothing but dominatability. And we have invented, in this case, we have invented the inferior to justify the idea and practice of superiority. And of course, I have to add that dominatability does not mean that somebody should be dominated. It means nothing else that somebody is dominatable, in the sense that if the one decides to put the boot into the other human being's face, it will work out. It will work out for the one, in the sense that a situation of domination can be produced. But just because something is possible, it doesn't mean that it should become a reality. So this pattern of superiority is repeated in many other, perhaps even all other forms of superiorism, for instance, in the sexist superiorism or in the specious superiorism. The superiorist seems not to be bothered with the forms of culture, the depth of knowledge, or the importance of a thought of the other human being. Superiorism is about the ability and the practical will to put your boot onto the face of the other, literally or by the power of faulty thinking. The one might have desires and rights, and the other might have too. But if the one is able and willing to practically subjugate the other, the history of Western thought has a clear and deeply irritating tendency to consider these very acts of epistemological and physical violence to be of highest value. There is, however, no excuse for this violence. There is no necessity for this violence. Its origin stems only from the self-aggrandizing narcissistic mania of the pseudo-superhuman. This violence is willed into existence by the pseudo-superhuman. This is not something anyone is forced to do. The one who is able to dominate is indeed able to do so, but by no means forced to do so. Human beings are not necessitated by anything to become superiorists. Nothing forces human beings to consider themselves superhumans. Superhumanism is a choice. Its immediate consequence, subhumanism, is not. If, however, superhumanism is willed into existence by the superiorist for nothing else but the superiorist's sake, Kant and Cartwright present their strange superiorist ideals to perfectionate human being. Superiorism indeed cares only about superiorism. It is a restless and compulsive form of excessive self-care. The superiorists just want more and more and more of themselves and for themselves. And since the superiorists cannot bear to be inconvenienced by a bad consciousness, they find a way to tell their very own story as if this story would not be a story of radical self-centeredness. So I want to finish with an outlook. I've tried to bring forward the cycle of superiorism, from the observation of difference to the normative interpretation of the difference and the deduction of entitlement to dominate, to the practical violent domination and its reinforcement. In some of the works, and I've tried to show that in some of the works of Immanuel Kant and Samuel Cartwright, and we can also show that in many other works, for example, as we've learned today in Aristotle, and we can also see it in many contemporary works of philosophy. What I want to try to point out in the end is 3 points. The first one is superiorist thinking is old. It is deeply written into our Western self-understanding. What would the Western world would be if we would have not decided to superioristically other and to subsequently enslave millions and millions of people, to superioristically other and subsequently force so many people to do what we, the alleged superhuman beings, order them to do. This is what we have done for a very long time, and we have developed one excuse after the other, from the natural slave theory to the idea of the giving and helping and caring colonizer. Why the profound contradictions to our very own values why it is we have developed so many excuses why the profound contradictions to our very own values can be ignored. We need to understand that we cannot uncritically continue these traditions of thought. If our understanding of Kant is correct in any way, if it is true that the founding father of enlightenment could be read parallel to the vile racist Samuel Cartwright, then we have to understand that there's a continuity from superior's past to superior's present. And we need to understand that one implication of this continuity could be that because we have not sufficiently and not seriously enough revisited and criticized our very own history of philosophical past. And the second point is there's a continuity from the superior's past to the superior's present. The West, wrote Richard Wright, has never really been honest with itself about how it overcame its own traditions and blinding customs. But we need to find that out. Richard Wright is absolutely on point here. If we ignore this task, we work towards the continued existence of the violence of the cycle of superiorism. We need to ask us, have we taken, for instance, the elitism of Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, Kant, Hegel, or Nietzsche seriously? Have we made sure that when we adopt ideas from their philosophies, that we do not involuntarily continue to philosophize in an elitist or superiorist way? It might be possible to avoid the superiorism of our past, but perhaps it might not be possible. So shouldn't we find that out? Perhaps one of the reasons why racism, sexism, speciesism, and so many other forms of superiorism are still so widespread is because we're fighting them while, unbeknownst to ourselves, we're defending them by continuing our superior's past. But there's more that we need to be aware of. We need to understand again and again that we have decided to become violent, be it physically, psychologically, or epistemologically. We need to understand that we decided to do so because we wanted to do so. This is no doubt a tragedy, but we are not necessitated to want this. We're not necessitated to do this, which leads me to my third remark. Superiorism is not a necessitated destiny. Superiorist violence was wanted and it was willed into existence. It was a human creation, and we can do otherwise. And that brings me to my last point. We can want to not be superiorist. We can unwant our superiorism. We do not need to be superiorist. It is a possibility. We know, we have experienced that. We should, at the tremendous number of ethical considerations the Western tradition has produced. Yes, they have to be re-examined, and there's a good reason, there's even a good reason to be suspicious that many of these considerations have never been taken seriously or have never been have been used to soothe our consciences. However, perhaps we can find that these ethical considerations indeed reflect an existential longing to be a decent human being. We should take this longing seriously, more seriously than we have ever done in our history. It has to affect us completely, our minds, our actions, our words, and our oughts. We can become, at least we can give it a try, to be how we have claimed to be for so long. We can try to eradicate the asterisk from our concept of the human being. We can try to overcome our historical amnesia or rewrite the history of philosophy or retrieve the stolen history, as Ruth Hagen-Gruber has described it. But to do so, we need to understand that the asterisk is there when the philosophers use the word human being. And it has been there for a very long time. Certainly, that will be very inconvenient. It will be a fight, it will be a struggle, and it will take a long time. And I'm speaking only to those who feel I am addressing them. If it was possible for millions and millions of human beings for this absurdly long time to suffer from superiorism, should it really be too much for us, the heirs and continuers of superiorism, to de-superiorize and de-superhumanize ourselves? Thank you very much.